Okay, so we're going to talk about the coercive paraphilias, the ones that require an unwilling or unknowing partner. We'll start with voyeuristic disorder, or what a lot of times is called a peeping Tom. And in this picture you can see she's, getting ready for bed, brushing her hair. She has no idea that that man's outside of her window peeping at her. So an unsuspecting person is changing their clothes, getting undressed, taking a shower, something like that, or there's a couple in there having sex and they don't know that they're being observed. For a peeping Tom, they like the situation where there's a possibility of being caught. That raises the arousal level. And so they may start off, this person in our picture here may have started off hiding in the bushes, 10 feet away from the window. And when he wasn't discovered, and that fantasy that he's been working with for the past week or whatever, while he masturbates, that has lost its power. And so he moves closer to the window and closer to the window until he's as close as we see him now. And maybe that will ultimately lose its power. And so then next thing you know, he's breaking into her apartment and watching from inside of her closet or something like that. So some of the common crimes are burglary or breaking and entering. Sometimes when they enter the victim's home, they are never detected by the victim, but they'll take like a trophy with them when they leave. So they'll take, a piece of clothing or a personal object to heighten their fantasy later. Sometimes it's escalated to rape, but it's pretty rare because a voyeur is pretty passive. And so this is a fairly uncommon escalation for peeping Toms. Interestingly, arson is associated with being a peeping Tom. It's called paraphilia. You might have heard of like a pyromaniac, somebody who likes to catch things on fire. A pyrophilic is somebody who loves fire. And so lighting fires and watching it burn would be sexually arousing. And sometimes fire departments report that they have found semen at the sites of arsons. And that's evidence that this was probably a pyrophiliac who lit this fire. Exhibitionistic disorder, what we often call a flasher, is where you flash your genitals to an unsuspecting person. Now, sometimes people will talk about, being an exhibitionist, like liking to show off your body or things like that. And that's a layperson term. For the paraphilia, it's specifically about showing your genitals to an unsuspecting person who doesn't want to see them and who is offended by them. In fact, for an exhibitionist, the goal is the look of shock. That look of shock, that look of horror is the thing that will fuel the fantasy. Now, there is a distinction between the type 1 and type 2 exposure. Type 1, when they flash, their penis is not erect. And so we call that the inhibited flaccid exposure. That's a person who is inhibited and unable to have healthy relationships with adults and is shy. And so when they're making their exposing, it's really to get a reaction out of somebody. In the type 2, we have a sociopathic exposer who is a person who is trying to actually harm the person that they're flashing. They want that victim to feel bad or to be scared. And they may have other kinds of conduct disorders or problems that they've been in trouble with the law for. So the sociopathic type is actually trying to be harmful, whereas the inhibited type is not. I actually have this video that I linked in the classroom about the bikini barista. If it doesn't run in the classroom, try running it from the, I guess you can't run it from this slide. I can't run it. My screen capture won't capture the sound. But that's the title of it, Bikini Barista Douses Flasher. And she does a great job of explaining the behavior of the exhibitionist and his persistence. He really wanted to see a look of shock on the victims' faces so that he could fantasize about that later. It looks like my video for frauderism's already gone away. Frauderism is where the person rubs up against an unsuspecting victim. A lot of times in a crowded situation, like on the subway or something like that, a woman will report that somebody just briefly brushed up against her buttocks, and by the time she turned to look to see who it was, he was already gone. But she could feel that he was aroused and that he rubbed up against her. That little moment of contact will serve as fodder for fantasy for quite a while for the frotteur. I had a student a number of years ago who worked in loss prevention at the time it was called the Bon Marché. It's Macy's now. And he said, I think we captured a frotteur on video. He said, we thought he was lining up to steal something from the women's department. So we were zoomed in on him because he was acting weird. And then he waited until a woman was looking at one of those circular displays, and he very quickly walked between her and the other display, putting his front toward her. And she barely even noticed that it happened, and we were like, what was that? And we didn't realize what it was. And then, after my description of fraudeurism, he's like, I think that's what happened. They chased him out of the store because they thought he had to have stolen something, and he didn't have anything. So more than likely, he had been loitering in the women's department waiting for a victim who would get into a spot where it would seem reasonable for him to brush up against her like that. That's kind of a typical frotteur's behavior. Sexual sadism is when you need your partner to be unwilling and experiencing some kind of suffering. Now, I couldn't find anything that would depict this that wasn't just like really horrifying. But this one kind of brings together psychology and sadism, at least. This isn't sexual sadism, but you see this guy's at a sleep lab, and you see the researchers out in the hallway waiting for how funny this is going to be when they wake him up with symbols. That's a little sadistic, right? Where they want to watch this poor this guy who's sleeping, suffer. And he didn't volunteer for that. He volunteered for a sleep study. And so it kind of depicts what we're talking about with sadism. It's funny. It's not as offensive as the stuff I found on the internet. With sexual sadism, it's not, you do this mean thing to the person not because it'll make you laugh, but because it'll make you aroused. So watching your partner suffer will provide the stimulation for sexual functioning. Statutory rape is another coercive paraphilia when it has objects that are not normal sexual objects. So a person who's reached puberty but isn't statutorily eligible to give consent yet, that would be a person who is kind of sort of an appropriate partner in the sense that they are sexually reproductively mature. They just aren't legally mature. So I'm not talking about that kind of statutory rape. I'm talking about a victim that can't give their consent because, for example, they're an animal. I gave you the link in the classroom for the documentary on zoophilia that pertained to Enumclaw. One of the things about this kind of zoophilia is that it may actually be a form of sadism that because they don't mind that the animal is suffering, or they might actually like it that the animal is suffering, because the animal isn't really the animal's not really equipped to be having sex with a human. So necrophilia is when you want to have sex with dead bodies. Now, the probability of being able to come into contact with dead bodies is pretty small. So this is a good example where a lot of times the person who suffers from this kind of paraphilia would get themselves into a job that would put them in contact with their love object, their sex object. So you see here on this video, morgue worker sexual diversity. This morgue, I don't know why it's called that. I don't know why it's called that. The correct part of it is that it is a morgue worker who was having sex with corpses. And come to find out, he was a county employee coming to work high on meth and drunk. I mean, there were just so many things wrong with this employee. But he was having sex with corpses. And they ultimately figured it out when the wife his wife came and complained that he was coming home smelling like sex, she said, is basically what she said. And yeah. Now, This comes up every once in a while. A person who handles dead bodies will be revealed to be a necrophiliac. Not very often, but occasionally. And so this guy, Mark Pipemeyer, said dealing with a guy like this, you're tempted to call him some type of animal. But that's not really fair to animals because animals don't do things like this. This is just one sick dude. It's easy to say stuff like that about a necrophiliac, except for that remember what the definition of natural is, right? Because if animals do it, I guess we can't really say it's not natural because animals do it. Look at this poor mouse that got caught in the trap, and look what the other mouse is doing to him. Or this deer who I guess that dog's owner just hunted, and the dog is, I mean, it's so inappropriate. What do you even say, right? But necrophilia is, among humans, pretty rare. Animals may have their own motives. I don't know exactly what the animals are doing. I think it has to do with dominance. And that's the thing about necrophilia, is that it also has to do with dominance. You absolutely are not going to hear anything back from that victim, are you? That victim can't say anything about what you're doing to him. Now, the other kind of statutory rape that I wanted to talk about with humans is if the victim has not reached puberty yet. So they clearly are statutory rape victims because they're under the legal age. And in addition to that, they haven't reached puberty yet. So the object of pedophilic disorder is prepubescent children. Now, I got this ad off of a Brazilian, what's it called? Public service announcement ad. And it says, turn off the lights and help Emily overcome her fear of the dark. And then when you turn off the lights, the lights will go off in a second. Emily's a good case because 66% of pedophilic victims are girls between the ages of 8 and 11. So you can see that they're not old enough to have reached puberty yet, but they're in that sort of tween stage. And 90% of the victims know their perpetrator. So see what happens when we turn off the light in this ad is we see why she's scared of the dark. 90% of victims know their perpetrator, and so oftentimes it's a babysitter or a family member or something like that, and so the child oftentimes is encouraged to be nice to that person and be around that person. And sometimes the family doesn't know that it's going on, sometimes they do, and they still encourage the child to have to face their molester. Now, there are different types of pedophiles, and it's easy to try and lump everybody into one category, and one category doesn't work for every pedophile. There's the personally immature pedophile, which is a person who's never had a mature sexual relationship, and it's almost as if they feel like a child is their appropriate sex partner. So they court the child like their romantic partner. It's thought that they aren't threatened by children, and so they feel like the child is appropriate. They feel like the child isn't going to judge them or feel superior to them, stuff like that. And so it's this type of pedophile who manipulates the child by saying things like, you can't tell anyone else because they won't understand our love, and someday when we can be together, and things like that. And they really manipulate the child into being on their side, really, and not ever wanting to tell. The regressed pedophile is one who has had mature sexual relationships, but for some reason his adequacy has been threatened. He's feeling unattractive. The regressed type is that when there are female pedophiles, they tend to fall into this category. They're feeling inadequate, they're feeling unattractive, they're feeling whatever, and a lot of times they'll molest people who they don't know very well. The most common kind of molestation is fondling, but it can be, for women pedophiles, it oftentimes takes the form of performing fellatio on their victim. But fondling the victim, having the victim fondle them, are very common ways of molesting children when you are a regressed pedophile. Aggressive pedophiles have a history of antisocial behavior. They oftentimes display a lot of misogyny, hostility towards women, where the women are the problem. And these are the ones that are the scary kind of pedophiles that we hear about on the news, where they kidnap a child and then they molest them and then kill them and leave them in a field and like that. Luckily, they are the least common, but aggressive, it's just so dramatic. You see what happens, and oftentimes there's like physical harm that comes from it. But the personally immature and the regressed oftentimes have produce lifelong psychological effects in their victims. So while they might not physically harm their victim, they may psychologically harm them. We see a drop over the past 20 years, 25 years of substantiated pedophilia cases in the U.S. It's been going down steadily and has stayed relatively low. We're not exactly sure why it's gone down and why it's been staying down. It's possible that it's because kids have been reporting before it escalates, because kids have been getting educated about what bad touching is and stuff like that. It's also possible that parents are more on the lookout. I know my kids were kids during the 90s and into the 00s, and we kept a tight leash on them. You just didn't let them go off with it just anyone, and didn't let them run around the neighborhood alone. And a lot of the things that I look back on fondly from my childhood, because nothing bad happened to me, my kids weren't really allowed to do because something bad might happen to them, because we're educated now. So not exactly sure why the numbers have gone down, but happily they have gone down significantly since their peak in the early 1990s. So what causes pedophilia is a really big question. Like, why are some people attracted to children? One theory is prenatal androgen exposure. We've talked about this a million times in class, but what we see among pedophiles is that they oftentimes have an altered 2D, 4D ratio, as you recall from previous lectures. Typically, males have a longer pointer finger than ring finger. And, yeah, I think I've got my ratios right. No, longer ring finger than pointer finger. It's oftentimes flipped in pedophiles. Not always, though. There is a higher rate of left-handedness, and we know that that's associated with excess testosterone in the womb. So it's not true for every pedophile, but it explains some at least. There are issues having to do with genes. Heritability is referring to maybe you inherited a tendency. Epigenetics refers to you have certain genes, and then with the right stimulation from the environment, you can end up with certain outcomes. And then certain life events, right? So stressful events during childhood have been associated with becoming a pedophile. Having had more head injuries before the age of 13 has been associated with becoming a pedophile. And then having a lower IQ plus a shorter stature has been associated with it. So these are things that, again, don't explain every single pedophile, but explain some. Having a higher than average sex drive. Maybe it's because, and I put question marks here because they're still trying to figure this out, maybe it's due to low serotonin inhibition, and so what that means is that they don't inhibit production of serotonin in certain circumstances. Maybe they have high dopamine excitation, so the pleasure centers in their brain become overactive in the wrong situation. Not really sure, but they're looking at that. Functional brain alterations. Maybe there is decreased prefrontal inhibition or temporal inhibition. Again, with a question mark. So they're exploring these different parts of the brain, knowing that the frontal lobe is in charge of making plans and following through with them, and knowing that the temporal lobe has to do with assessing situations and stuff like that. Maybe there's some kind of functional difference. So maybe there's some kind of just general alteration of the neuropsychological function, where the way that the brain is activating and then making the person think certain thoughts or be attracted to certain kinds of things. And then structural brain alterations. Again, with question marks. They're examining maybe differences in size in the amygdala. The amygdala is in charge of feelings of fear and aggression. So maybe there's something about the size of the amygdala that's affecting the pedophile's brain and the way it functions. Maybe the hypothalamus is bigger or smaller in a person who's attracted to children. So they're examining these. Everything with a question mark are really hot topics right now in research on pedophiles. The ones that don't have question marks are things that have been correlationally associated with being a pedophile. Long story short, we just don't know why some people are directed towards children. I just really want to point out that with the new definitions in the DSM-5, there has been sort of an assumption that psychologists are starting to view attraction to children as a type of sexual orientation, and that is a real simplification of what the DSM-5 is suggesting. What the DSM-5 is looking at is the possibility that a person's habits, attractions, predilections might have been shaped in some fashion, and that it doesn't mean that it's fine and okay. What it means is that that the person may not be in complete control of their impulses. Okay, enough on that. Let's come back in the next segment and we'll talk about non-coercive paraphilias.